It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jen Tilton. She's a professor of race and ethnic studies here at the University of Redlands. Her Ph.D. is in American culture and anthropology from the University of Michigan, and her work combines geography, history, and anthropology to explore how race gets built into space, politics, and public policy in the U.S. She works with the Bridges That Carried Us Over project to support a community-led effort to document Black history in the Inland Empire, and is one of the leaders of A People's History in the IE, a collaboration with Catherine Goodus at the University of California in Riverside, which works with students and community leaders to build digital archives, historic census maps, georeferenced archives, and story maps that make visible historic communities of color and patterns of segregation in the Inland Empire. Let's give a hand to Professor Tilton.
Hello, hello. Thanks so much for joining me today and inviting me to share some of our work. I'm just going to point out that the charming young man in the front of this picture is with us today, and so thank you, Clarence Butler, for joining us and for finding this picture for us. So I want to start by putting our work to map a people's history in a little bit of context of the statewide and national conversations we are having today and, keep having repeatedly over and over again. We've been talking more and more and being more conscious of the way race and racism have shaped the landscapes we live in, right? We see this in California's new effort to have ethnic studies as a requirement, something that's going to get our students, even in high school, thinking about the diversity of the communities they live in. We also see this in a whole bunch of new, great ESRI, equity and diversity story map collections. You see just one here that really features some great story maps that highlight the history of redlining nationally, that explore how racism has shaped public health or the environment, and that really lift up some stories of diverse communities nationally. And I kind of think we need to bring this work home, because there's a real temptation here in Southern California to think that maybe we're different than the South or the Midwest, to say to ourselves, our schools weren't really segregated because they weren't usually segregated by law, or that maybe because some of our communities have always been racially integrated, that race didn't matter so much here. And so I think we really have to bring this conversation home and think about how race shaped our landscape and how racism shaped our communities in the past and in ways that still reverberate in the present. So today I'm going to share how we're doing this with A People's History of the IE. And this name, A People's History, is of course a reference to Howard Zinn's classic book that asked us to really think about building history from the bottom up, celebrating the everyday people who fought for just and equal communities. And the People's History of the IE, as we call it, is really a fluid collaboration, community members and scholars throughout the region, a lot of students, and an enormous amount of technical support from the Spatial Studies Center. The People's History Project has two main components. Here's a little introduction. The first part is really, we're working to build what Genevieve Carpaio calls a rebel archive. And this means we're working alongside family and community history keepers to create accessible collections of oral histories, documents, and photographs like these that tell the stories of communities of color and working class communities and LGBT communities right here in the IE. And these pictures that I chose for you today are literally all taken within 1 mile of the university. So here you see some of these digital archives and stories as they're currently available online, and some lesson plans that have already been developed. We're building a new website that will host all of these materials, including a new set of lesson plans that some local teachers are developing using the archives that will, in collaboration with UCLA's History and Geography project, that we hope will help bring some of these archives and histories into our K-12 schools. Together, this work aims to challenge what scholars call the Anglo-fantasy past. And this is really a way of remembering our history that highlights the stories of wealthy white residents and literally erases many of the people who built our communities. This is particularly evident in nostalgic displays of citrus labels like this one, where there are no people in the groves at all. And I see the power of this fantasy when I teach students who grew up right here in Redlands or in the IE, and who are then surprised to find out that there were vibrant Black communities here and Mexican-American communities here all the way back in our history. So to counter this erasure, our archiving and mapping work especially focuses on communities of color and on neighborhoods that have experienced systematic disinvestment and erasure. Neighborhoods, places that are more often stigmatized than they're celebrated as historically important. And you see on this map some of the places we're focused on, where we're building digital archives and working with local history keepers. That includes East Side Riverside, Casablanca, Inland Mexican Heritage, which has done a lot of work to document the Mexican-American communities of North Redlands, and Amina Carter's Bridges Project, which has built archives of Black history throughout the region, particularly documenting Valley Truck Farms and West Side San Bernardino. And we've, of course, built additional collaborations with Redlands Second Baptist Church and Clarence Butler, who's here with us today, to document the Black history of Redlands itself. So the second part of this project, though, focuses on building maps, and that's what we're here to talk about today, and story maps, because I think maps might be uniquely able to bring historic communities to life and to really challenge the erasure and marginalization of historic communities, both in the landscape and in our memories. But mapping this kind of history is super hard and really time-consuming. And you can't actually go to Esri to get the data you want. We can, of course, go to Esri Maps and see great existing contemporary data, right, that lets us map inequalities across the landscape, right? So we can see here, this is a map of heat islands. We know this area is getting really hot in the summer, but that heat is not equally shared. Communities in North Redlands have more heat islands than South Redlands, where there are more tree cover, house lots are larger, there's less concrete, and thus it's less hot, right? We can also use existing data from Esri to look here and see that those patterns between North and South Redlands also track racial differences between those two communities. South Redlands, as we know, is a predominantly, is it going to let me click? Yes, a predominantly white, non-Hispanic community. North Redlands is predominantly Hispanic, right? So we can use existing Esri data to see these broad patterns, but we can't really figure out how and why these patterns developed. We can't see that using the data Esri has for us. So this is a mapping challenge for a bunch of reasons. I'm just going to highlight two. First, the historical maps we might use as visual guides to these complex histories don't exist for our region. So in a lot of places, we would use historic redlining maps to kind of track histories of race in a region. We don't have them because the IE was too rural in the early 20th century for the federal government to bother mapping. There also, until now, didn't really exist historic census maps that went back before 1960 for our region, so we couldn't really see historic patterns of settlement. And second kind of dilemma, and this is probably obvious, but historical archives and stories don't exist in prepackaged CSV files we can put in ArcGIS and map. I really wish they did. It would save us all a lot of work, but they don't. So 4 years ago, we went to work with Lisa Benvenuti and David Smith at the Spatial Studies Center to create the infrastructure that would let us begin to map a people's history. And students have been engaged in all phases of this mapping. Really, I've learned ArcGIS alongside them. I had zero skills before, and so really, it's wonderful that the University of Redlands has invested in this infrastructure because it enables both faculty who have no skills to get them and for the community to participate as well. So what kinds of maps have we built, or what infrastructure have we built? So the first thing we've done is we've built historic census maps from 1900 to 1940. And we've done this with the work of amazing GIS interns from the master's program, but also undergraduate students who've helped us build these maps. This means we're able now to start to map person-level historic census data from 1900 to 1940 at the level of census enumeration districts. And that's what old census tracts, basically old census tracts. But to do this, it's really hard, right? So we do this by reading descriptions of census tracts, of enumeration districts that look like this, by trying to pore over these crazy, really blurry census maps when we're lucky enough to have them, And by digging in and trying to find other historical sources that will let us figure out what on earth were precinct boundaries in Redlands in 1910, and we end up with these great, beautiful-looking enumeration district geometries. This is from 1940 for the whole IE, so San Bernardino and Riverside counties. It looks really clean and simple and beautiful, but it took the work of 5 interns for 3 years, and it's still not all done for all 5 decades. So huge amounts of work. We also had to download and process person-level data from IPUMs. So University of Minnesota has processed and made available to scholars person-level census data. But when you download it, this is not exactly mappable as it is, right? So we have to do a lot of work to clean up that data, to create pivot tables of that data so we can map by ED. So huge amount of labor. We also knew we were always interested in mapping patterns of segregation over time and historic racial and ethnic communities. And so we had to create categories where we could meaningfully track these groups over time, because of course the census uses different categories for race almost every decade, particularly in the early 20th century when these are changing a lot. So these are some of the categories we will now be able to map across time for those first 5 decades of the 20th century. And I'll just share a few sample maps so you can see the range of data we'll have to play with when we publish all of this summer. And the goal is really to publish all of this material so people in the community, scholars, students, community members can look at it, play with it, ask questions, develop new projects, and develop new story maps. Okay, so here are just a couple maps to share with you. We can start to look at where folks settle. So here on the left, we see where Black folks are living in 1940. And here, when I slide right, we can see where folks with Mexican ancestry are living in 1940. And I'll note a couple of patterns here. We can see that there are big areas of the region like South Redlands, like North San Bernardino, where neither Black and Mexican folks are living in 1940. We can see that there are communities that Black and Mexican folks share in 1940, North Redlands, west side of San Bernardino. And there are also some distinctive communities, right? South Colton is by 1940 a real center of Mexican American life. And the south part of San Bernardino, which is where the Valley Truck Farms community is, it becomes a real center of African American life. So we can begin to see some of those patterns. We're also going to be able to map some key employment and income data. And this is just a fun map, right? I just took one of these. This is mapping where railroad workers live in 1940. I love this map, right? You see, maybe not surprising, that a lot of folks who work for the railroad live near Santa Fe rail yards, right? In San Bernardino, in Colton. If you zoom out a little bit, you can also see a kind of concentration up in Barstow. So you just can begin to see some kind of interesting employment data, right? We also are going to be able to map citizenship, birthplace, and immigration and citizenship status. Right here, we're mapping the birthplace of folks born in Japan in 1910. And you can see a real concentration here in the center of Redlands downtown, where 138 folks who were born in Japan lived, mostly in tenements along the Zenki River, we know from other maps and other research. We also are doing some work to map, to track particular different variables by race. So I'm very interested in homeownership by race, so we'll be able to create maps of, say, Mexican American homeownership rates, or Mexican homeownership rates, African American homeownership rates. And here, we have a map where we can see birthplaces of Black migrants to the region, because we were interested in tracking the Great Migration here. So if I turn on this little legend on the side, you can see in San Bernardino, in the different EDs, where Black folks came from who lived here in 1940. We see that Texas, this color here, right, is a pretty big sending state to this region. But you also see folks really spread across a whole range of other states. Alabama, Kansas, Georgia, right, Mississippi. We can also start to see some patterns, right? We can see that there are a bunch of folks from Alabama here in Valley Truck Farms, and there aren't many folks from Alabama over here on the west side, right? We can begin to identify some of these patterns. Now, there's a lot of data here. And I do not know how to make good maps out of a lot of these data. This is not a great map, right? So one thing I'm really hoping in presenting this to you all today is that I get some folks who are really good at making maps who want to come play with this data and help us create great maps out of the mountains of data that we will have. So some of these maps, though, let us see some broad patterns, right? But they can't actually tell us the whole historical story, right? We can't figure out, well, why did people move to these particular neighborhoods and not other neighborhoods, right? What are the communities they built in these neighborhoods? The churches, the businesses, right? The social networks, right, that shaped these neighborhoods. To do that, we had to build a whole different kind of map. And this one also takes a huge amount of work. This is a kind of map of the archives. We call it the People's History of the Archive Map. And what you're looking at is a super messy back end of this database of people and places and events. This database right now has over 2,800 dots. Here it's displayed by race and ethnicity. So how did we build this crazy map that you see here with all these different dots and different colors, right? What is it? Over the last 4 years, I've taught kind of 4 versions of my Mapping Race in the IE class. And in that class, students have listened to oral histories, explored photo collections, read historic newspapers, looking for place-based stories. Right? We've also worked with interns at UCR, at Cal State San Bernardino. We have a faculty member from Brown who's joining the project and hoping to involve some of his students. And as we find place-based stories, we also chase down the addresses, right? Where did this person live? Where was this business? And we put that data all on the map. We also have identified particular neighborhoods we're interested in. These are the places we're building stories about, right? Building archives in collaboration with community members. And so in those places, we've also done some deeper dives into those neighborhoods, sometimes mapping individuals who live on this, everyone who lives on a certain street or in a certain census tract, or tracing down really the business owners, the civil rights leaders in particular neighborhoods. So this archival map grows as students and faculty take on new projects. So just as one example, now here's just what the database looks like. Right? This is the very first person we put on the map, Carl Sepulveda, who lived only a few blocks from here. So just this fall in my class, I had a team of students who took on the task of mapping the early history of the Black community in North Fontana. This was a vibrant community, began in the sort of 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what you see here, they built a kind of story map out of their research into this neighborhood, but they also put every homeowner, every church, every business that they discovered into this database itself. And you see here some of these sources. And we're planning to work this summer, I hope, with one of the community history keepers from North Fontana, who will kind of help us edit the story map draft that they created, add her knowledge and the photos she's collected over the years, and really turn that into a resource for the community. So this historic database that we've got lets us begin to see some historic patterns really over the 20th century. This has really helped us start to map the history of civil rights organizing in our region, which was invaluable when we worked with Black Voice News and some other folks to create story maps for the first exhibit at the Civil Rights Institute of Inland Southern California, which opened last fall, and which hosts kind of 3 maps we produced in collaboration with Black Voice News. Shout out to Candace in the room. And here you see just some of the back-end work we did to enable us to really understand the networks that created the civil rights struggle in the IE. So right here in this map, you see the founders of San Bernardino's NAACP from 1918, right? And we see, looking at this map, that these founders who we've identified, almost all were neighbors, right? They lived together on the west side. They attended these 2 historic churches. I can zoom in here with a great Sanborn map, which we also helped digitize. And they also built these businesses in the neighborhood. My favorite business is one that 2 NAACP founders, Mr. Mabra and Mr. Hamilton, started. It was a fish truck delivery service, which in 1918 was driving around in a beautifully painted white Ford truck delivering fish around San Bernardino. So these are the folks who built the first civil rights organization in San Bernardino, and we're able to sort of see and map that story through building this archival database. We also can see some less happy stories, right? We can map KKK activity in our region from the 20s to the early 60s. We can see that right down the street, 3 blocks from where we stand, there was a big KKK initiation in 1924. And track other kind of KKK rallies and activities. We can also begin to see some of the ways communities fought back against the Klan. My favorite story is from right here in front of San Bernardino High School, where Bobby Bivens remembered back in 1960 or 61 that the Klan was planning to march down E Street right in front of the high school, and the football team was like, I don't think so. And so the black players and the white players and the Asian players left the school and kicked the Klan out of town. They're like, not in front of my school. So, we can see these kind of interesting stories and begin to put those pieces together. Just as one example of why this archive map helps us see stories we might not otherwise see. We were working on a story map of the history of spatial segregation in public accommodations in Redlands. This was a student project. And we realized that there was this interesting story of solidarity right here on Orange Street. We had already mapped a Japanese family who lived right here and ran a pool hall barbershop, kind of great combination, starting in 1910. And Nathan Gonzalez from AK Smiley had done a bit of research into that building, and so we got some more stories of some of the Japanese owners of that business over time. But as the students were working to map Mexican-American oral histories from Redlands, they discovered several Mexican-American elders talking about how that they couldn't get haircuts in most of the barbershops in town, but there was the one Japanese barbershop and pool hall where they could get their haircut. And that they remember, including Blas Collazo, you see this quote here, and we realized we had that location. We knew who started that barbershop, right? And we could see that right there in a building that still exists on Orange Street, right near here. All right, getting tired. Okay, so you can see here the full collection of the people's history of the IE story maps we've so far built. There are a whole bunch more that are really in the queue. These are drafts students have created and that we're working to kind of revise and publish. And these story maps really help us see some historic communities, like Valley Truck Farms, which I mentioned before. We can see this vibrant community built up in South San Bernardino, the homes, the churches, the schools that folks built. And we can see through story maps the slow erasure of that community as warehouses built over that thriving community over the last few decades. There's still a few homes left. There's one historic church, St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. But when my student and I went to visit the pastor of that church last summer to talk to him and do an interview for Bridges, he said that they were going to sell the church soon because you couldn't have a viable church in a neighborhood surrounded by warehouses. And so I think for me, like that story makes this work kind of urgent because we can, as the landscape is changing so quickly, this kind of movement of historical recovery lets us preserve for future generations a sense of what is literally disappearing under the concrete. And I want to share just a little bit more of one story map in some more detail, because I think it makes clear how we can use both of these kinds of maps that we've created to answer what I think is a really important historical question. And in fact, the question that led me down the rabbit hole into doing this historical work in the first place, which is, how is it that racial segregation was built right here in the Inland Empire? So we've worked to answer this question in a story map called Color Lines in San Bernardino, which will be published along with a special Black Voice News series on redlining here in the IE in the next couple of weeks. Although we don't have redlining maps for our regions, we can start to use these census maps to really get a sense of how and when redlining segregation was produced. And we can use the archive map to really add stories to the picture. So we can see here, right, a map we've seen before where Black folks live in 1940, right? Folks are concentrated here in Valley Truck Farms and a growing community on the west side. The Black community here is still very small, right? The west side here is only 17%, 10% Black in a predominantly Mexican-American community. But the community grows in the 1960s as the kind of second wave of the Great Migration brings more folks to the region, working in industries often associated with the growth of Norton Air Force Base, Kaiser Steel, offering more economic opportunities. And then by 1970, we can see that the Black community has substantially expanded on the west side, extended west and north, and really also become more concentrated. So now the heart of the west side by 1970 is 70% Black, 20% Mexican American. I just want to point out, right, here we are in 1970. This is a good, I don't know, depending on how you count, 10, 15 years after the civil rights movement is really kicking off nationally and locally. And we still have giant swaths of territory that are not at all Black, right? The north side of San Bernardino, south side of Redlands, kind of really white spaces. And you'll note here that the percent of Spanish surname is what it is in 1970. Population is slightly higher than the Black percentage. And so I just kind of want to put on the table that these patterns of segregation I'm going to be talking about today affected Mexican Americans in the region too. But as you see from this map in 1970, the color lines were a little more flexible for Mexican American folks than for African American folks in this area, in this era. Folks who were lighter skinned, more middle class in the Mexican American community had a tiny bit more spatial mobility than African Americans did. So we return to this core question. How did these patterns get created in the first place? So nationally, when folks try to answer this question, they tend to focus on federal policies created during the New Deal that encouraged banks to lend to white-only neighborhoods. And these national FHA policies assuredly had impacts right here in the IE. Just because we don't have the redlining maps, it doesn't mean that those same practices in terms of discrimination and home loans weren't happening. But we also, by digging into the local archives, can begin to see some of the local practices that really set the stage, that created the foundation of racial segregation before the New Deal, and that then defended those color lines through the 60s. So to see how the color line is first created, we have to go back to the 20s. In early decades of settlement in the region, there aren't really hard and fast lines of segregation. Black populations are small, so are Mexican American populations, and scattered throughout the city of San Bernardino. But as you start to get into the 1920s, you really see a hardening and a more organized effort to create color lines that control a growing Mexican American and African American population, control where they could move. And what we begin to see in the 20s throughout Southern California is the creation of restrictive covenants. I call this step one in the process. We see here a restrictive covenant actually from Redlands, and you can see the text here. This is from the McKinley Tract that says the property cannot be sold, rented, or used by anyone who is not white unless they work for the white family. The important domestic servant exception. These restrictive covenants were advertised widely in the newspaper, right? Here we have an advertisement from 1921 in San Bernardino about a new development opening, saying quite explicitly here the property is restricted to the white race. A lot of these restrictions that are advertised in the newspaper are more vague. They talk more about, highly restricted tract or it's a restricted development. But this would be language that people at the time knew what it meant. And part of the way we know this is that African American realtors almost always say that the developments they're selling are unrestricted, right, as a marker that anyone is in fact welcome. So interestingly, when you look at the geography of these tracts, these are a sample of advertisements from the San Bernardino Sun from 1921 to 1946. And we can see sort of their effectiveness at controlling where Black folks settle. This is these restrictive covenants, and then again where the Black population is living in 1940. And when you look more at these, it's quite interesting to see what the individual restrictions, what the history is a little bit. The first one that I found was actually from 1921, and it's on 10th Street, just literally 2 blocks above what is the center of the Mexican-American barrio and a growing Black settlement. And during this time period, white property owners are in fact demanding that the city help their effort to control and exclude the growing Mexican population from moving north out of the barrio in particular. According to Manuel Delgado, property owners on 9th Street agreed to restrict home buyers to whites only, right? We see this in the advertisement too. And the city agrees to help their efforts by improving sewers, curbs, and sidewalks in the all-white neighborhoods bordering the barrio, with the goal of increasing home values in the hope that that would create an additional financial barrier for white home buyers, and for Black or Mexican American home buyers. And this pattern of investment in the infrastructure of white neighborhoods would continue for decades. When you read some of these advertisements in more detail, this is, if you can have a favorite of a racist advertisement, this is my favorite racist advertisement. I know that's a really weird thing to say, but this one really makes clear how they are selling the dream of homeownership to working class white renters as a path to stability and future wealth, right? It's got this big rent payers rejoice. And then it gets more into detail. It promises that when renters buy, their property will, quote, make you money while you sleep. It is a chance to be somebody and get somewhere, right? But this same ad has the explicit racial restriction. In explicitly restricting this promise to white families buying homes, I think we really see the beginning, the roots, and the cause of the racial disparity in homeownership rates, which in fact only grow through the 20th century. Now, Black families did not simply accept these racial boundaries. Folks pushed up against these racial boundaries in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And sometimes they were met with a pretty violent defense of the color line. Here are 4 kind of documented cases, here put over the map of the Black population in 1960, of racial violence in response to these efforts to cross the color line. Probably the most well-known, that many of you may know this story, many of you may not, happened in Fontana in 1945, where O'Day Short, his wife Helen, and 2 young daughters moved into a 5-acre property they had bought on the corner of Pepper and Randall. They had built their own house. Now they knew about, but did not accept, the racial boundary in Fontana, which insisted that Black folks had to live above baseline in the vibrant Black community of North Fontana. But he wanted to live closer to his new job at Kaiser Steel. So they moved into this neighborhood, and they immediately faced escalating threats of vigilante violence. This included a visit by a San Bernardino sheriff who told O'Day Short that he was, quote, out of bounds, and who told the North Fontana's NAACP president, anything can happen. We can prevent a lot of trouble if we get him to move. And just 2 weeks after they moved in, the home exploded in a massive fire that killed the entire family. This was not the last case of vigilante violence in the region. We see here a few other cases in the 50s and early 60s where Black families moved into previously all-white neighborhoods, and there were cross burnings or bombings of cars or home bombings. Fortunately, no one else was injured. And interestingly, a lot of these Black pioneers were more middle class and more educated than their white neighbors. Several were actually officers at Norton Air Force Base. Now, these weren't common, right? These weren't common happenings, but they really did remain vivid in the memories of Black residents, and they helped to define some of these spaces as places that would be hostile to Black settlement, really into the 60s. And for the most part, as we again look at the kind of geography of where folks live in 1960, we see that this effectively worked to defend the color line. Now, the important exception is right here on the west side, where there was this car bombing in 1957, but where that didn't really stop the rapid racial segregation and transformation of the neighborhood. And when we dig into some of the oral histories collected by the Bridges Project, we can really begin to see how and why color lines shifted on the west side, but also how they kept getting recreated. And so I want to just listen to a couple of these stories and show you how that process of white flight worked. So after World War II, Jack Hill, who had grown up in San Bernardino, was a World War II vet, moved back to town, and he moved actually onto 10th Street into a development that he said was one of the first small developments built primarily for Black home buyers. I'll note that this is just a couple blocks north of that previous color line from the 1920s. But in this time period, a lot of Black elders still remember that in San Bernardino, families couldn't easily buy homes across baseline, right? Just a few years later, though, Lois Carson moved onto 16th Street, and I'm going to let her tell the story of what happened when she moved into that neighborhood.
I moved on 16th Street, and we integrated that street because I'm Catholic and I started going to St. Anthony Church there. So we saw a house for sale and it was close to the church. Seemed like a really good idea. So we talked the lady who was selling them into selling us the home. And the little kids next door told my kids the dog didn't even like black people. But we made it out. We became friends with the neighbors. But in time, you know, it turned black.
Now, that wasn't an uncommon story for us to hear. Just 4 years later and 4 blocks north, Jean Peacock told a very similar story, Dr. Jean Peacock, about being one of the first black families to move into her neighborhood. There was no real hostility, but a few years later, it turned from all white to all black. And later, Lois Carson, in the early 60s, she moves onto the Rialto bench, and she explained that she began with that move to understand the power of real estate agents in shaping this story. And so again, I'll let Lois Carson, who's no longer with us, tell her story.
And I didn't really understand blockbusting till I came here, because we moved here, it was in the process of being blockbusted. And a white woman from 6th Street came here and sat down with me and said, we already have 2 black families on this street. Can we sell you one that looks like this on another street? I said, lady, when I'm spending this kind of money, nobody shopped for me, and I'm staying right here. But we really thought, she and I started working together with other people in the community to try to reverse the blockbusting that was going on, but we lost that battle.
As Lois Carson's story shows, this pattern of black migration, followed by white flight, moved the color line north and later extended it west in San Bernardino. Real estate agents were funneling aspiring black homebuyers into these newly integrated neighborhoods, and then escalating the racial transformation of those neighborhoods, while still leaving some neighborhoods entirely white. And this repeated process effectively resegregated neighborhoods again and again across the decades. Civil rights leader Frances Grice really said that she came to understand how racial segregation worked through her experiences with real estate agents. She said, every time I'd go to a real estate agent, they'd send me back across the bridge. They kept sending me back to Helen James and Talmadge Hughes and said, oh, we've got some good real estate people that can help you. And I'm like, how come you can't help me? She realized, though, that they were sending her back across the freeway to work with the 2 black real estate agents in San Bernardino at the time, or the 2 most prominent ones. And she really added, she said, this was my first time feeling that there was something wrong in this community. This beautiful valley that I'd seen, something was wrong. Then I noticed that all the black people lived on the other side of the freeway. And I want to thank Carolyn Tillman, who did this amazing interview with Frances Grice, is with us here today, so thank you, Carolyn. In addition to real estate agents, interviews with black elders also highlight the importance of the informal practices of landlords, who also defended white spaces through the 60s. And we really see this in the story of Jimmy Jews, who became the first black firefighter in San Bernardino. And he moved to work at Patton State Hospital in 1961 and wanted to live close to work.
I started trying to get apartments over on the east side, Derrill's area, that area. I walked up there and they had vacancies. Oh, I'm sorry, we just filled that vacancy. Okay. So my friend, after about the 3rd one, he said, stay at the car center. He went up there. Oh yes, we got it, I'll show it to you. He said, come on, Jimmy. She saw me come in, she said, you know what, I just remembered. We just filled that one. But after that, I said, just take me over the west side of town.
So from mapping these oral histories, we really get a sense of some of the local practices and processes that are producing the patterns of racial segregation we see in these census maps. Now, I want to think a little bit about the consequences, just in conclusion, the consequences of this history of housing segregation. So first, I think importantly, segregated housing created segregated and unequal schools in our region. One of the story maps in our collection explores the city's decades-long struggle for school desegregation. You see here a map created with data from the Citizens Committee to Study Desegregation in 1966. They defined as segregated any school that was 85% white or 85% minority. And you see here this pattern that the over 85% white schools are all here in the north. Minority schools, which we code here as both majority Black or majority Latino, are here. And there are some integrated schools in San Bernardino in the center of the city, but that doesn't undo the fact that there was this still massive pattern of racial segregation. It's actually Frances Grice's experience moving across these boundaries that prompted her activism. Her son first went to a predominantly white school here, and then when she couldn't find a place to live on the west side, she had to move to the west side, and she was told by the school district that her kid would have to move schools and come to Franklin, which was, I think, 90% Black and Latino. And the schools also were radically unequal in their facilities, right? The schools up here in the north side were all brand new facilities. They had air conditioning. On the west side, they were old schools, no air conditioning. And it was really those inequalities that really began the conversation in San Bernardino that led to the decades-long fight for school desegregation. Frances Grice and others worked together to found the Community League of Mothers. You see some great photos here of their protests at the school board. And ultimately, their frustration with that decades-long fight led to them launching a legal struggle along with the NAACP in 1972 that ultimately forced legal desegregation of the schools in San Bernardino. You see here this amazing photo of Bobby Bivens at Muscat's PTA back in 1972, and it was this kind of PTA that was the center of the folks who were the plaintiffs in that legal suit. Okay. Now, this vibrant history, this of activism, though, that emerges, I actually think also comes out of this history of segregation. The Black community was incredibly tightly networked in the small space of the West Side in ways that built relationships that fed political organizing. And a lot of people fondly remember the sense of belonging that emerged inside this segregated community where people knew each other, where there was a dense network of homeowners and business owners. And to kind of capture that perspective, I want to share just Cheryl Brown's brief clip talking about growing up on the West Side in the 50s.
We had a great neighborhood with wonderful, wonderful people. We had the doctor lived next door to us. Dr. Holder lived next door to us. Yeah. Across the street were two teachers. On the corner was a military family. Across the street was others. It was a great community. It was segregated. San Bernardino was segregated. If you were Black, you couldn't live in a white neighborhood here. You had to live in your own neighborhood. And I lived in the 20th Street neighborhood, which was just, as I look back on it now, it was quite an experience for us to grow up in and to get to feel good about yourself because you could see other people who were so successful living in that same neighborhood. That's one of the things that integration robbed from us.
So as Cheryl Brown hints at here, in the 70s and 80s, we start to see the slow breakdown of some of these color lines. The Black middle class, here's a Black population in 1980. The Black middle class was able to move into historically white neighborhoods in Rialto, and we saw the increasing class fragmentation of Black communities across the landscape. And as Cheryl Brown pointed out, that did destabilize the community on the West Side in some ways. But the vibrant community on the West Side was also destroyed by a range of state policies that economically devastated and sometimes physically destroyed Black and Mexican communities. And the most stark example is the way the freeway was built. You probably have noticed the freeway going through these maps I've been showing you over time. And really the 215 freeway became a symbol of segregation. Hardy Brown Sr. called it the Berlin Wall. And not just because it cut off the West Side, but because literally, as some of you may remember, the freeway was intentionally built so that all the exits and on-ramps went downtown and not to the West Side. And that really had incredibly detrimental effects to the economic health of the vibrant Black and Mexican business district along Mount Vernon. And I'm not going to play another video for you, but in the full story map, Lois Carson really talks about the substantial effects that city planning decision had. So I think that freeway was really one of many planning decisions that systematically disinvested in Black and Mexican neighborhood of the West Side. And fundamentally, I think, though I can't quite prove this argument yet, that the history of white flight and disinvestment also helped to destabilize the economic foundation of the city of San Bernardino itself in really significant ways. The history of housing segregation certainly helped to create and maintain the racial disparities between Black and white households that we see today. And surprisingly, when you actually look at homeownership rates by race, which I literally just calculated this week, we see that the Black-white disparity by race actually got substantially worse between 1940 and today. In 1940, Black homeownership rates are slightly higher than white homeownership rates in the IE. This is particularly stark in Riverside County, where 54% of Black households own their own home and only, what do I want to say, 45% of white homeowners do. But you see, by 2022, a rapid expansion of white homeownership rates and either a stagnation or a decline in Black homeownership rates. I think fundamentally, what we see here is that the New Deal and federal investments in expanding homeownership really worked to expand white homeownership over the 20th century. White working-class homeowners were able to buy homes in those rapidly expanding suburban areas and to reap the benefits as the home values increased in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Really, this promise in that advertisement from 1921 was made real, but only for white homeowners. But this history of housing segregation confined aspiring Black homeowners, of which there were many, to older neighborhoods and undercut Black homeownership gains and wealth gains. Redevelopment erased many historic centers of Black homeownership, like the Valley Truck Farms, and as homeowners were displaced, a lot ended up as renters or moved out of the region. Even as more Black folks went to college and entered the middle class in the 70s and 80s, Black homebuyers faced ongoing discrimination in housing markets, often paying higher interest rates on home loans and seeing their home values increase less quickly than in white neighborhoods, and often because white homeowners avoid buying in minority neighborhoods, and that continues to this day. I think this history of housing segregation created this logic of valuing white spaces that we still live in and still live with. Over the next few months in California, we're going to have the opportunity to have some conversations, maybe substantial, maybe not, about what we should do about this history. California's Reparations Task Force has identified homeownership as one of its primary areas of study, and is proposing and asking us questions to debate as a state about what we should do about this real history of harm and the effects it has had on wealth in Black and white communities. This story map I've just shared, I hope, as it gets released with Black Voice News, will help our region reckon a bit with this history and its longstanding consequences. And I will end there. Thanks.
Do we have any questions?
Who wants to play with mapping data with me? Because there's like a lot of stuff. Any questions?
So what was the most difficult part of mapping? Oh,
drawing the damn enumeration districts.
What was hard about that?
Just the sources are terrible, right? So figuring out really how to draw the boundaries. I mean, sometimes we had to go back and literally hand read census files and figure out what streets were actually in that ED. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's the most annoying hard. You know, it's hard and very time consuming to find the pieces in the archive and put them in the archive map and then begin to find the stories in it. But that part is incredibly satisfying. So that's hard, but you know, you can see the fruit of the work, whereas the drawing the enumeration districts, it's a long time till you see the fruit of that labor. Yeah, Tom.
Did you find any more restrictive covenants and wetlands besides the McKinley tract?
Yeah, we found a few. But it's actually been surprisingly hard, right? As you know from, I had a student, Brandon Alvarez, who really tried to go and dig into the county archives to identify, like in the home deeds, to find the restrictive covenants. And he found a few others, certainly the country club estates tracts up there. He found some, but in a lot of, it's super time consuming because you have to literally go in and trace it back in the archives and whatever, it's really complicated. But in a lot of them, he would find language that said, this, deed includes all previous restrictions, but he wouldn't actually find the previous restrictions, and so we couldn't tell whether they had them or not. So I think we have to do some more deep diving, like you've done, into some of the newspapers for Redlands, right, to figure out which communities were actively organizing, because sometimes it wasn't even the racial restrictions, it was that kind of organizing effort, like we saw in the west side of San Bernardino case, where white neighbors were, using political power also, and just networks to exclude folks. So sometimes it was the deeds, and sometimes it was, more informal networks that are harder to document. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
So what would, might want to repeat that because we have a live stream.
Oh yeah. So you were just saying that there was a lot of connections with the School of Business on inequalities in terms of technology. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, John. Oh. Well, so the interviews that you see represented in this are, some of them indeed I did do, but lots of them were done before I ever joined this project, right? So the Bridges Project has been going on for 15 years. Carolyn Tillman interviewed Francis Grice in 2003, I think. And so Amina Carter's been building that archive for 15 years plus, for a long time, for 20 years, right? Oh my God, 20 years. So there are tons of those oral histories that have already been built. And then, yes, for the parts that I've been involved in building more recently, so to document particularly, say, Redlands Black history, or to chase down some more of the civil rights history, some of it is sort of people identifying folks we should interview, right? So Lois Carson had been interviewed before, but Amina was like, you got to go back and interview Lois Carson again. And we were blessed to interview her just, I think, like 3 days before she died. And she shared all these amazing stories with us. And then, for like Redlands, Bishop Green, I think, connected me with you, Clarence Butler. And then Clarence Butler and I have gone to interview other folks who had historic memories of, Fanny Sargent, who's also passed. So people, we've looked and prioritized trying to interview the oldest folks, just out of an acknowledgement that people don't stay with us forever. But also, people tell us who the important people to interview are. So we were trying to trace down more of Francis Grice's story. And thank goodness Carolyn Tillman found the recording, so the next time I show this oral history, we'll have her voice. But everyone said we had to talk to Bobby Bivens, so we did, 2 4-hour interviews with Bobby Bivens. So it's kind of, who gets identified, and who the community history keepers really have already done a lot of work documenting the history. So some of it is also just that collaboration.
Kathy, did you have a question?
Yeah.
So thanks, Jen, and for all the folks here who've been working on these amazing projects. I'm wondering, and I'll take the home ownership piece.
Yeah.
And you may not have gotten there
Yeah.
yet, but are you seeing, this kind of sort of like male-headed household home, right, like model, right? Particularly thinking post-World War II, like the imposition of the sort of nuclear family. Are you seeing replication of that in, right, the sort of non-white communities, right? You're thinking about questions of business ownership, right, and the ways in which, right, that does or does not, is not sort of replicating these kind of emergent patriarchal norms that you're seeing in white communities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is really whether in the archives we see similar sort of in the 1950s and 60s dominance of a kind of patriarchal norm of male-headed households playing out in Mexican-American and African-American households. I would say, that's a messy question. That's a really messy question. And certainly, one thing I've noticed is people like Frances Grace, who was a kind of independent woman leading a group of mothers, got a lot of flack and got a lot of disrespect, both from white school board members, but who kind of challenged her both because she was, a single mother, because she was not middle class and not educated, right? Like, all these kinds of ways she was excluded by that community, but also faced a lot of flack from Black middle class politics of respectability who didn't think she should be the person leading the movement. And so there was a lot of that. It's messy.
I think we're going to draw this to a close.
Yeah.
I have a few. Well, let's give Professor Tilton a hand again.